Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. Today, we have a deeply impactful conversation with Connie A. Baker, the author of Traumatized by Religious Abuse. Before we dive into today's episodes, I want to address a couple things. First, you might have noticed I accidentally published 2 episodes last Tuesday. Whoops. Yes, I'm human, and sometimes I shuffle things around as I try to find the best way to present them to you. So, if you got this episode early, that's why. Also, I recorded this conversation with Connie back in October last year, and reflecting on it now, it's incredible to see how much I've changed in just a few months, and how my childhood vulnerabilities played a huge role in some of the dangerous decisions that I've made, whether that was embracing promiscuity, or engaging in unhealthy relationships, or getting involved in harmful groups and ideologies. So now let's get on with the conversation with Connie. Connie's journey from growing up in a rigid, authoritarian household to becoming a trauma recovery specialist is both inspiring and transformative. In her book, Connie shares her personal story and explores how religious abuse manifests within cult-like cultures and how survivors can reclaim their personal power. In our conversation, Connie reflects on her own path towards recognizing the abuse that she endured, the importance of slowing down in recovery, and the emotional devastation of the second wound, the judgment and betrayal often faced when survivors speak out. She also offers profound insights on how spiritual abuse erodes self-trust and how we can begin to rebuild it. One powerful concept we discuss is spectrum-based thinking, the idea of understanding abusive behavior not as so black and white, but as a spectrum that spans from unhealthy to healthy, helping survivors navigate their healing process with clarity and nuance. If you or anyone you've known has ever struggled to heal from the trauma of religious abuse or wondered how to find your way back to emotional and spiritual autonomy, this episode is for you. Let's dive in. Right, everybody, we are here with Connie A. Baker, and I am in tears because I am so grateful for her work. I just finished reading her book, Traumatized by Religious Abuse, and some folks have to take it slow. Your girl got through it in 10 days, 11 days, about that. And it was so validating and educational and helpful, and Connie's here to break it down. So thank you for joining us today.
Oh, Megan, I'm really happy to be here. Yes, to just be with you and your people.
And we connected that we have a passion and love for Portland, Oregon, and all the fun folks who are gravitated towards that place. And I was really appreciative of that. And you can hug and kiss the Pacific Northwest for me, will you?
I will.
So where's the best place before we kick off into the nitty gritty for our audience to contact you? Like, where's your preferred place for them to reach out?
Yes. Well, you can do it through my website, ConnieABaker.com. My middle name's Ann. So Connie, ConnieA, Baker, BAKER.com. Or Connie, email Connie@ConnieABaker.com. So whatever, there's ways to get to me either way that I'd be thrilled to hear from you.
Great. And I will link those in the show notes to make it easy for you guys. And you also have an Instagram page and you post some really helpful quotes on there. And that's actually how I found you. I really resonated with those quotes. That led me to your book. I was like, well, if these quotes are good, I'm assuming the book is good. So you kicked it off with your, you wove in your journey all throughout the book, which I really did appreciate. And you shared how you grew up in a rigid authoritarian household to becoming a trauma recovery specialist. And your whole journey was deeply impactful. And I could relate to your background and how you grew up. I did not grow up religious, but I did grow up in that sort of and I want to give some grace to our parents because it was like the thing during that time.
Totally.
So can you share what led you to realize that the experiences within your church and your family were abusive, and how this realization shaped your path towards writing Traumatized by Religious Abuse?
Yeah. So, there's a few stories in that question. My family was a very interesting contrast because on the dark side, I got spanked / beaten with belts, for doing pretty minor infractions. And my parents were young. Both of them, 21 when I was born. They were trying to figure themselves out. And I was a firstborn, and they were both firstborns. And so I'm always like, pardon the twitch, here I am, a firstborn of two firstborns. And, so there was some really, my dad specifically had some really unresolved stuff in his. They thought they were doing the right thing. They had this super compliant daughter who wanted to be good. And if they were just hard on her, she was going to do the right thing and turn out right. And then you put on the religious paradigm on top of that this isn't just being a nice person, but this is doing right by God. And they were doing what everybody else around them was doing in terms of discipline. It was just the thing. And so that was the dark side. The contrast is, my parents really loved me, and they really supported me. And I never doubted that they loved me, which, of course, as we know, sometimes is more, kind of blows your mind a little bit as a little kid. Like, well, okay, so this spanking I'm getting with a belt is love, and it's like, super confusing. So,
yes.
But it wasn't, but it is now in retrospect. But at the time, it was just it was an accepted thing. So that was family. And so my parents truly were supportive, were loving, were nurturing. Well, my dad was a lot of fun. He was a very involved dad. He was fun. He was, so there was this contrast, this mix. Okay, but what they were at the core was very rigid. And you play by the rules, you do it right, you do it perfect, you do blah, blah, blah. So there was that context. Then you bring that family into a church that reinforced all the same things: obligation, responsibility, perfection, playing by the rules, don't step out of line or the results are going to be catastrophic. And so I grew up in that religious construct. And so that's kind of the family oriented thing. Then I was a good little firstborn. Like, I can play by rules. Heck yeah. You want me to achieve? Oh, I'm on it. You bet. And I'm going to be the best Christian anybody can be. And so, of course, I said to myself, what's the best? Oh, missionaries are the ones that are exalted, and they're the ones who sacrifice so greatly. And so I'm like, okay, that's where I'm going. Now, was that a conscious thing? I don't think so.
Right.
It was just an impulsive thing that goes not impulsive, an instinctive thing that in me that said, okay, if I'm going to do this, I'm doing it all the way.
Well, if you're motivated by achievement and you look out into the crowd or your community and you see what's getting the most elevation or feedback, you're obviously going to be motivated to do that. As a perfectionist, as someone seeking, like, if I have to achieve to get recognition and love, then that's what I'm going to go do, because I want to bring the most people to the kingdom. Like I was told, I can relate to a lot of your experience, that I wasn't a real disciple in Jesus Christ unless I made disciples.
Right. Oh,
I can relate to your experience very much.
Absolutely. I was all in. So I said, all right. So then I go to Bible school. I start going to a church. I can take an hour to tell my story or 4 sentences. So I'll try to find a happy medium here. But I went to a church that I gave my soul to. I loved this church. I was my senior year in Bible college. I found this church. I loved what they were doing. They were extremely missions oriented, and I was all in. They were doing it in some pretty innovative ways. I'm like, yes, this is awesome. And at that time, I was introduced to a pastor who ended up being what I considered at the time like a second dad to me. He was almost my dad's age, and we got along great. And he really paved the way for me to go into some mission stuff. And about 5 years into that, I realized he was making sexual advances. And I was really naive sexually and romantically. I'd had one boyfriend in junior high. I was like focused, like, I'm just doing my thing. And so this really was confusing, caught me off guard. And for 9 months, according to my timeline, there was a lot of grooming now looking back, but according to my time, for 9 months, he sexually abused me. And in the end, I wanted out. And I said, I want to tell the church elders because I feel so horrible about whatever's going on. And he said, if you tell, I have a loaded gun by my bed and I'll kill myself. I'm too unstable, which was some truth at that point. He was really unstable. And I knew that intuitively. And I don't think that, in retrospect, I don't think that was just a fake, I think it was the risk was very real. And so, and even if it was, it doesn't matter. He was manipulating and trapping me big time. And so finally, 9 months later, I said, I'm setting a date. If you don't tell by then, I'm going to. He ended up telling the elders. So that's the first part of the story, the sexual assault that was horrible. The second part of the story, which to me had the greater impact, I always say the sexual assault was about a quarter, 25% of my damage, and it was big. But how the church leadership handled it was 75. It obliterated me. It destroyed me for years. And basically, I came back and they blamed me for the problem. And he had taken off across country. He was an alcoholic and he drove across country in a drunken stupor. And I came back and said, I want to make this right. And they said, okay, you need to confess your sin in front of our church, 2 services. And then we need you to leave this church so he and his wife and kids can heal. We need you to move 300 miles south to your parents' house. I'm 26 at this point to live with them and basically get you out of here so they can heal. And because I was so wanting to say, oh, okay, I'm repentant. I'll do whatever, So I move away from a life I loved, from all my friendship, all my support structure, to a little town in Southern Oregon where my parents lived, and tried to recover. And so, I was blamed for it. I was the whole thing. At that point, Megan, it's hard to put into words. My reputation was shattered. My identity was shattered. I mean, I was a young adult. I was still figuring out who I was. And this it shattered me to the core. I didn't know if I wanted to live. I didn't know if I wanted to have anything to do with God. I didn't know if I wanted to have anything to do with church. And it took me about a decade to think, oh, maybe I could thrive again. That's too long. There was nobody talking about spiritual abuse, religious abuse. Nobody. This was 1990. Yeah. Nobody was talking about that. It was not a cultural conversation like it is today. Right. And you Google religious abuse and all the forums come up, all the groups, all the books, da-da-da-da-da. And that's only been in the last 3 to 5 years. I mean, so all that to say, I was totally alone. Nobody knew how to explain or describe what the heck I had been through, except for sexual abuse. Finally, I realized, I guess I was sexually abused. I thought it was an emotional affair, which is why I was willing to just take responsibility and felt so ashamed of what I had done, quotes, Anyway, so that's basically my story of coming out of deep depression, severe panic attacks, finding my ground, taking 10 years to go, oh, I could maybe thrive. I could maybe really have a good life. And so then through the years, I told my story, I think 9 years after it happened publicly for the first time. And from then, I've been more and more open and went back to get my degree in counseling to become a psychotherapist and realized this is what I want to specialize in. And then in 2019, released my book. So
after working with lots of folks and kind of really getting to
Oh, hundreds.
for so much. And you really put a lot together, which we'll break down. But I want to touch on many things that you just said. I can't imagine, because in the 1990s, there hadn't been, I think there was a little bit of talk around sexual abuse in 1987, I feel like. In the
Yes, sexual abuse was much more of a cultural conversation.
Right. But the power dynamics, which you really take time to explain, and how that can influence. And that's really, really important to look at in regards to how much service and volunteer work is, whether it's in the church or the missionary. And so, I want to touch on the poem, but because you already talked about the second wound, you spoke about how, sure, the damage was 25%, but sharing your story and the reaction was 75% of the trauma. And that isn't the first time I've heard about the second wound, but you really broke it down the best I'd heard of it in the book. And so I wanted to, for the listeners, say that, the second wound refers to emotional and psychological damage that survivors will experience, not just from the initial abuse, but from the response they receive when they speak out. And that might be met with disbelief, judgment, or betrayal by those that they trust. And we see this very often in the church community. And that's not done in a malevolent, or whatever the word would be, in a bad way, because the community is so deeply entied with identity. Yes. And so it's like, so this sounds really similar to the John MacArthur situation. They really do public sin confessing, or, he shames women from the pulpit there in a form of church discipline. This is common in mega churches, small churches. This is not just, isolated event. I'm sure you've heard.
Oh, no, I wish it were isolated.
I agree. And so, what would your advice be to those who may still be facing resistance from their communities when they try to tell their stories?
Oh, first of all, before you tell your story, you got to count your cost. Like, you cannot go into it. But this sounds horrible to say, but you cannot go into it assuming the best.
Right.
You can't. You have to know that. Well, let's step back even further to understand why. Let's take my church, which I think is that church that this happened in, is a great example. People loved that church. They loved it. It was their community. It was their social support. It was their social network. It was super important to them. Now, the structure of the church was authoritarian. You listened to what the leadership said, and you did it. And if you questioned it, you started getting black marks. You started getting, there was retaliation, subtle and overt, to saying that didn't sit right with me. And now all of a sudden you're the problem. I mean, that's part of an abusive system. If you say there's a problem, you become the problem. That's a real huge axiom. So these people had massive risk to go to the leadership and say, we don't like what you did to Connie. And if they took a stand, they were going to lose their own community. I mean, and that is no small thing. I mean, we all, it's easy for us as survivors to sit around and go, well, nobody came to my defense. What a bunch of scummy humans.
Right.
You know what? I did that for 6 years in that church while I watched people go through church discipline, and I did not defend them. And now I go back and I've tried to make some amends and go back and say, I was part of that system that hurt you. And I'm so sorry, but I wasn't willing to give up my community for that. I wasn't willing to go head to head with something I disagreed when I had watched what had happened to the people before me who'd gone head to head. Okay, I'm building a structure here to say, don't expect support.
Right.
Like, the price is so high. Do you get it sometimes? Yes, you do. There were a few people who were like, especially in later years, said, oh my goodness, Connie, that I hate what happened to you. I questioned it. But at the time, everybody was just taking the leadership stance and going, well, Connie needs to confess her sin and Connie needs to move out of here. So when you go through that, first of all, don't, understand the dynamics that are so deep and even unconscious in the people in the congregation. They're holding on to their community. We are tribal community people in our genetics. We need community. So it's the price is so high. All right, that said, find people who get it. You are going to have, especially from the community you've been booted from, they have too much to lose to say, oh my gosh, yes. Then they have a moral, ethical choice between you and their whole community. So find people. The irony is the narrative from my community in that church was Connie's a slut. Connie's a whore. Connie did it wrong. Connie was very bad. Now we can't trust Connie. Oh, that was a big thing. Oh, we thought we could trust you. We cannot trust you anymore. I mean, there were so many horrible things said. That was the narrative. And a few years later, when I finally could even tell my story, I was still taking responsibility. And people outside that church were horrified with how I'd been treated. And their narrative was, what the hell happened? What? Are you kidding me? And to have that reflected back was so significant. It's like, well, yeah, that's kind of how I felt, And so a person needs to find community. They need to find individuals either who've gone through it or who can look it in the face and say, that was screwed up. That was horrible. That was not okay to ever to do that to someone, to another human. But if you are steeped in that mentality, my perspective, the first many times I heard that was, yeah, but I think their hearts were right. They were just doing what they knew they needed to do, and da-da-da-da. And I think there's still some truth to that. I think that they were doing what they thought they should do, and it was wrong.
Right.
Everybody from the outside said, whoa, so wrong.
Right.
And so you need people around you to reflect back how not okay what happened to you was, because the people in the community are not going to do that.
No.
So those are huge things. And of course, there's a big long list of find some good books, find bibliotherapy, so to speak, get a therapist. You probably have severe PTSD. I did, and I didn't even know what to call it when I was doing panic attacks and blacking out in department stores. Like, I didn't even know what that was. And so It was terrifying. If I would have understood this is PTSD, I'm doing panic attacks. I knew I was doing depression. Back in 1990, we understood depression.
But not like triggers and, emotional hijacks from the amygdala taking over, like all.
We did not get that.
Right.
And so I didn't even understand what was happening. So yes, there's therapists who get this, and there's therapists now who are getting how this looks in a religious context. And so there's all kinds of things I could say. Mostly, can I just give you a hug if you've been through the second wound?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I felt your entire book was. I cried tears of validation multiple times. And I was getting a lot of validation through education, which you say, like, I am obsessed with reading. And we've talked about this privately off mic, but bibliotherapy is my jam. And I just made a reel posting about that. And I love books, and I've recommended a ton of books on my blog and on my Instagram for those of you listening. I hope that you've leaned into those resources as I have. And I just can't stress enough how validating it is finding people who can understand. And for me, something I didn't really share with you, I did. I built all season 1, Taste of Truth Tuesday, was fundamentalist Christian. Most of my Instagram following was that as well. So I was definitely getting lots of fans until I switched perspective, and still I started questioning the patriarchy, and until I started questioning the abuse that I was under in my biblical counseling program, and just the theory. And that was, I wish I had a little bit more guidance there on just opening up to the same community that had abused me. Mm-hmm. That was really brutal. Definitely probably some of the hardest parts of my life. And I do see now on the back end, I'm much more compassionate than I even was in the beginning of the season, which is really cool to see growth and evolution there in my own journey. So I do appreciate finding compassion as you do, taking responsibility for where I was participating in this, and then also perpetuating the abuse. You've talked a lot about that in your book. Before I move on, I did want to mention a couple things that I missed. In the very beginning of your book, you mentioned being a recovery bulldozer. And I kind of talked about that because I went knee deep into, I don't work currently, so I was listening to podcasts and books, and people saw how fast I deconstructed. It was like in 2 months. I went from being like fundamentally Christian to atheist. And even in your book, you talked about the spectrum that we go through in this deconstruction process. A lot of folks will go straight to materialism, denying anything spiritual, but I didn't really want to do that. But it was kind of so anyways, you mentioned always wanting to push through to get through things as quickly as possible. And that was me during my religious phase. I wanted to rush sanctification. I've always wanted to rush a diet. I'm sure a lot of people can relate, trying to get through stuff as quick as possible, especially stuff that sucks. Can you remind readers that abuse recovery is not something that can be rushed? I can relate to that reminder as it's a default setting for me. How can survivors, especially those of us who are using whether that's disassociation? Dr. Mark Gregory Karras said, facts don't heal the tracks. I really appreciate that mantra. To learn how to slow down, to approach the healing process with patience, that's really uncomfortable for me. I just wanted to hurry up and get through it. So why is it essential to slow down for true recovery?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I wish people asked that more. My clients, if they were here in spirit, would be going, oh, yeah, we talk about this all the time, because I've got I have some clients that have the wisdom to say slow is good, but most of us are like, no, bad.
I say that to my personal training clients. I'm always, but yeah, it's hard to practice what you preach, I guess.
Yes. I use a lot the metaphor of the body to relate to the psyche, and to, if we have, let's say we're in a car accident and we get broken up, we get a concussion, we get internal bleeding, we have fractures that have messed up our structure, and we go in and we can push for recovery. We can push, and then we can push too hard, and we can say, oh, I just did more damage to that by pushing too hard. But you can't make the body heal any faster than it is healing. Can you support it? Yes. Can you take extra vitamins? Can you, supplements? Can you do your physical therapy consistently? Can you not put nasty stuff in your system? Yes. Now, that said, there are some things that slow down a physical recovery. So, infection, can infection happen? Can now, because your left hip was broken, your right knee is going really bad? Yes. So this is how I visualize this with somebody who's been through trauma, is your body is going to heal. I'm here to watch for infection, i.e. PTSD that gets stuck, not just a traumatic response, but now your brain is in a groove of that. So I'm here to watch for infection. I'm here to watch for compensatory behavior. Oh, your right knee is hurting. Let's look at how we can get you to walk better with that left hip injury to where you won't. How can we get you a cane, during this recovery? And that, it just takes as long as it takes, is, I guess, the bottom line. It takes as long. Now, again, we can get infections. We can let something go way too long, and now we have its own issue. But it takes a long time when you've been through a psychological car wreck and have just your system's been brutalized. It's going to take a long time. And that's part of therapy too, is to say, what are these parts of me that just keep pushing when I can see it's hurting myself? This happened to me with cancer. I'm a cancer survivor, and I went through about 3 years of a lot of yuck. And I literally watched myself. One of my survival mechanisms is push harder. Oh, that works. That intersects quite poorly with cancer recovery. But I would literally watch that part take over. And I'm thinking, I'm hurting myself.
Right.
I'm hurting myself, and I can't stop, because that survival part was pushing so hard. So that's where I needed, and I did get into therapy, and I still do therapy every other week. To me, it's just, for me, it is a life thing. I got to keep in shape. It's kind of like going to the gym or physical therapy. Like, yeah, I gotta keep.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I don't know, this was not something I wrote down in our notes, but maybe something you always spoke to me. You spoke to me that you're good on the fly. And so I'm not sure if you've seen this rhetoric where it was a book by Abigail, I forget what her last name was, talking about bad therapy. And Elisa Childers and some fundamentalist Christians said that actually therapy is leading to deconstruction. And so there's all this focus on the self and self-help and you spend all this time in your trauma, then of course you're going to end up being a whiny narcissist snowflake. Have you heard any of this?
Oh gosh, yes, of course.
Okay, so can we touch on that before we kind of get back to our standardized questions that we prepared for? Because I've heard that, and in my complex PTSD book that I heard from Pete Walker, he said folks that have complex PTSD, sometimes it's gonna take a long time to develop a safe attachment, secure attachment. And sometimes like that verbal ventilation and that communication is actually one of the best, most healing things we can do. And it can take a long time. So I was just so gratified to understand there's a lot of reasons to why it takes a long time. And that's not a nice way to approach healing in any way. So
that's it. And you got, yes, none of us are going to sit there and say to a person who's been through mangled in a car wreck, say, why aren't you doing better? Are you working on this hard enough? Are you sure your doctor's really doing a good job? It's like, dude, look what's happened to you. Of course. Oh, crap. So now your knee is hurting. I get that. Oh, so annoying. So sorry. It's clear. It's not clear in the psyche.
Right.
And I want to say this. There are a range of incompetent to bad therapists. It's a profession. Like, of course there are.
Bad apples everywhere.
Everywhere. And good, well-intended and bad. Like, and I think of all the pieces I pick up of people who've gone to Christian counselors, even like licensed therapists who are Christian, who have layered on the trauma for somebody who's gone. And my first counselor, I went to way back, like after I moved home, like a month after I moved home after the abuse, said, well, let's look at where you need to take responsibility for this. Well, I didn't go back to her. Thank God, because that was actually my narrative in my head. But something about it said, that just hurts. That is hurting me. That is not helping. And finally, I got into a therapist who actually was a Christian. And she was like, oh, that was abuse. And I'm like, oh, thank you. I mean, this is back now in 94. That was like 3 or 4 years later. So there are some therapists out there who are maybe well-intended, but uninformed and have their own agenda for you. And that is dangerous ground. That is not okay on any end.
Right.
I don't want to send a Christian person, a friend of mine maybe, to a therapist who is not a Christian, who is not going to be respectful of their faith, their values. That's our job as therapists, is be respectful of where your client's coming from. And that's not your job to change their worldview. So all that to say, so you've got some bad therapists in there, and you've got some mediocre, incompetent therapists who honestly, okay, I'm going to say something a little controversial, are just going to use talk therapy for severe PTSD. It is embodied. You've got to find a therapist who is using an embodied form of therapy, because trauma resides in our body, not just our nervous system. It's in our muscles, our gut. It's our whole body. So a lot of therapists, especially ones trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, which I use in my practice often.
Right.
They'll say, if we can just think your way out of all this trauma, use your cognitive, and you want some CBT, you want some of that in there, but you need more if you've gone through that. So you need EMDR, you need brain spotting, you need other embodied, those are the two I'm trained in, but there's other very valid embodied forms of therapy that release trauma physically. And some therapists are not there. I have clients come to me and say, after a few sessions with me, they'll say, oh my goodness, my last therapist, sweet as anything. They were just the sweetest thing. But all they would do is say, so how are you feeling? Ooh, that sounds very hard. And you want that validation, of course. I mean, it's like, hello, that's part of therapy, but it didn't go further. And they're just like so frustrated going, okay, I'm talking, but I need help. And so in terms of therapy, these people who are making those accusations, number one, don't understand therapy. They don't understand the process. And they may be referring to people they've seen go to therapists who actually are fairly ineffective. That's fine. That's fair, but don't lump it all in, because I get to see people unburdened, free, healing, moving, thriving after therapy. So, I mean, my clients, I always say, darn it, my clients get better, and I'm like, they do. It takes time.
Yeah. It should show. It should show for itself. It's not that you have to like tell people you're in therapy. It should show over time some sort of, and that's been huge in my life since I got out of the abusive biblical counseling program just in the beginning of this year to now. My life looks like night and day. When we started doing dialectical behavior therapy, and skills has been helpful, like more mindfulness, more radical acceptance.
Yes.
But yeah, the EMDR, and we've talked about EFT, emotional freedom tap.
Yes.
Very accessible. And has, more and more data coming that it can help in regards to phobias and more generalized things. And EMDR can be very specific. I've also heard of brain spotting, someone we had previous in season 1. And I'll link some of those notes in the show notes for folks who might want to learn more about those techniques to understand, wow, maybe I need to understand more about this embodied stuff. Because for me, that did speed up my healing. When I first did EMDR in 2022, I had been in therapy. I've been diagnosed 1,000,001 things, all talk therapy until 2022 for my whole life. And it was like, so it's like serious speed through. Not that talk therapy is terrible, but yeah, really get into the embodiment, really get into specific situations. There's a lot of reparenting, a lot, and the Complex PTSD book by Pete Walker, there's a lot of applicable stuff about like the inner and outer critic. And that's something that I have to work through. When you mentioned the bulldozer being even in your cancer, and thank goodness that you have beaten that in that bulldozer mode, and how that doesn't benefit us. That's like the 4 Fs, right? You were stuck in the fight, flight, or maybe a blend of two. And that's probably relatable to a lot of us.
Yeah.
They're trying to deal with something. And so I really appreciate just how open, I'm pretty open with my story as well, but I'm so fresh into it. Appreciate the perspective shifts that you can provide looking back. And I already have my own perspective shifts. So you encourage me that I'll continue to get more and more colorful. And instead of dark, it'll become more and more appreciative.
Yes, colorful.
So something that I did want to say, speaking of colorful, you shared a vivid and deep, painful memories about your public confession that we spoke of. You shared, you had to say in front of 2 church meetings, not mass congregations, your public confession. And so you wrote a poem about it, and it's called Say It With Your Best Dress. And it really moved me to tears. I love poetry. And you had a heartful message to the readers. You said, my heart is deeply in this material with you. You offer so much validation, tools, and hope for recovery. I just really wanted to touch base on that. Do you want to say anything? Because it's kind of like out of order with our questions about that poem and where you are now about that shift that you have through the time.
Yeah, I wrote that poem about 7 years after. And the point of the poem, say it with your best dress on. It was reflecting on that morning that I was getting dressed and ready and standing in front of the mirror before I knew I was going to go in front of the congregation that I had deeply invested in, held leadership positions in, and I was going to get up there and basically say, I'm a whore and forgive me. It was, and I was looking in the mirror and trying, I think, to say, how do I cover myself? How I am utterly defenseless. I think at one point in the poem, I haven't read it for probably several months, but the fabric feels so thin. It was like, I'm standing up here naked, it feels like, in front of everyone, and saying, yes, you can judge me and all my flaws. And I was saying this even in 7 years later, I was still taking some responsibility for what, quote, I had done. And it's funny, our stories shift, and they should, as we synthesize. Our brain is geared towards story. That's how we're going to tell. If we tell our life story, we're leaving out 99.999% of our life, because we can't tell. I was born in the hospital, and the next minute this happened, and the next, I mean, we're leaving out days, weeks, years of our story. Right. So what we do is we select what was meaningful, how we have interpreted our own life. And I wrote my story of abuse probably 3 years after it happened. I wrote it again 7 years after it happened. I wrote it again 9 years at my first public statement. And even 9 years in, it had changed. It had morphed. And it's not that I was changing the story in the sense of accuracy or content. I was getting more clear on what actually happened to me. And so that changed how I told that story. And then, of course, by the time it hit the book in 2019, it had changed more. And because I had changed more, and there again, I wasn't changing the facts. I was changing what I understood the actual story to be, and integrating that and synthesizing it into a story that makes much more sense than the one I initially told.
Right. That's like the fog had continued to clear and clear. So that little blip about the fabric was, put on your best dress, Connie, the new white one with the blue flowers. Why does this fabric feel so thin? Because today you will be the Sunday dinner conversation topic in every home. Motive questions, life analyzed, heart dissected. Yeah, I'll post it in the show notes. If I read it, I'll cry. I've already times. It's really intense. So I appreciate you sharing the perspective and the shift, because for me, I look back at having 3 abortions, being in sex work, whether I was in the lens of my fundamentalist Christian community, how they viewed that one, or now when I'm trying to figure that out, I still have a lot of regret and sadness about that. I haven't really touched on the depth that spiritual abuse really is, because when God is brought into the equation, it's a whole nother ballpark. Like your mom, your dad, your community, your pastor, that is not a laughing matter. It hits. And but man, when God is brought in there, that's hits your soul in a way that I never understand.
It is utterly, I talk about this. Some people, after they go through this, they say, I am not spiritual. No, I'm not a part of that. You said you cuss on here. Okay. I'm not part of that shit at all.
Yeah.
And it's like,
I mark every episode as explicit because I forget. I'm just probably
likely. Anyway, so they're saying, no way. And I get that. I get why they would say, I am distancing myself from everything. And even people who remain a person of faith or some type of spirituality, religious and spiritual abuse, I use those words interchangeably, religious, spiritual abuse. It hits at the most existential questions of meaning, of truth, of origins, of life after death, these utterly existential questions. And it hits at the core of our identity because of that. And that's where yes, are there ways in which sexual assault does that? Yes, but it is a whole nother level. And I'm not minimizing sexual assault. I've had sexual assault a few times, and I'm not minimizing it. I'm just saying the spiritual end, basically in my story, God was the one, in my mind, God was the one telling me what a horrible slut I was, and how, and that I needed to leave my community. I needed to be banished. And there was not much left for me.
Right.
And that was the whole point of my existence was God. And So, and I've integrated back spiritual life, certain realms of faith and that sort of thing. So, and that's been my journey.
Yeah.
But it's not everybody's journey.
It's not. And I have no idea where I could end up. I could have told you, Kale, no, 3 months ago, but now I'm like, who knows? So, to sum up this amazing conversation, I really want to touch on what you stressed in your book, how important it is for those of us who have survived this to define abuse. Especially since minimizing our experiences is actually potentially helpful in the initial aspect of survival, but true healing will require us, right? Like, it's okay. Denial is a part of grief, but
an essential part.
Yes. Thank you. And, I'm not the expert, you are, but when you talk about this true healing, that's going to require us to name the abuse for what it is. And then I also mentioned on an episode, sometimes we can fall into the dogma of like name it to tame it, because you might not be able to specifically name as an event. Sometimes it might be very generalized, like a bunch of little cuts. So we don't want to get too much into the certainty of naming something. But regardless, my dear friend who I think of, who is deconstructing, she didn't experience sexual abuse. She experienced an abusive biblical counseling program. So she didn't even touch on anything like our stories, but she is still suffering from depression and PTSD experience due to the fear and the guilt and the manipulation. So can you just touch on how important it is for survivors to fully recognize and define what happened to them, and in this process of gaining clarity to help their healing and their future protection?
Yeah. Right. Well, that's implicit in the question is part of the answer. It is important for yourself. I think, I'm careful with the words abuse. I'm careful with the words cult. I'm careful because I don't want to ever drain the meaning out of that.
Yeah.
But everything is on a spectrum. Everything. And so I think defining was this abuse? First of all, there's resistance to it. It took me years to think that I was abused. There are a certain strand of personality types who are very happy to say that they were abused. It's how they have learned to cope with the world, and they're very comfortable. That's only a certain strand. Most of my clients take a long time to say that was abuse, because it feels shitty to say that. It feels shitty to say I was abused. I was like, oh, no. I was in charge of me.
Yeah.
I chose this. That was a much more comfortable narrative. The problem is it wasn't accurate. I was leveraged. I was manipulated by somebody with much greater power, much greater psychological savvy over people. It was abuse. Somebody, and I define abuse in my book, and it's basically some person, group of people, or institution that has greater power than that individual, leveraging that power, usually using, in religious abuse, using God or religious ideas to hurt, shame, silence, weaken, control, manipulate, the person who has less power. That's the definition of abuse. And that, to realize that, is important for healing. If you go in there saying that wasn't abuse, I chose this, I would have been very susceptible to repeat the same thing again if I didn't. And the core of this is understanding power dynamics, power differentials. What in any given relationship, there is a power differential. And sometimes that's very mixed and kind of complicated about who has more power. Like a marriage, there's all kinds of layers of who has more power where. In a marriage, the more equal the power, the more healthy the relationship. That's science. That's like researched. But even in best friendships, the more equal the power, the better. But there's also appropriate times. My surgeon, who gave me a huge neck dissection from my ear way to the other side of my neck, that guy had more power than me. I was under anesthesia. He took a knife to my neck. And that is an appropriate power differential. He was a wonderful surgeon, a good man, was very clear, and it was very consensual in the sense that I'm saying, yes, I'm signing on the line. I understand this, but he had more power. He needed to. That was a right thing. The issue is, did he abuse that power differential?
Right.
And he didn't. Now, there are other people in my life who've had way more power than me that have absolutely abused that power differential. And that is where it's important to say, oh, that's what abuse looks like, even in its subtle forms.
Yeah, we talk about that in Commercial Cults. I was recruited into a multi-level marketing company by my ex-employers who had employed me in a gym. So they not only did that, I already have a power dynamic with them. I looked up to them. They were my employers. They were successful business owners. They were like, oh my gosh, you're going to be great for this. They love bombed me. They recruited me into that. And so it's very easy to not really see that those can be at a disadvantage for you.
Yes.
Any means. And so really understanding that, I mean, in my deconstruction out of this high control version of Christianity, I saw how I had fallen for similar manipulation tactics. And I guess that was like my third cult I had been in. It wasn't the first one. And that's why we opened up this conversation with our childhoods and the authoritarian dynamics there that can set us up for not really being able to say no, not really understanding boundaries. And that is why it's really just important to have these, nuanced conversations. In the book, you do define so much. You say that every church, religious organization, and leader is on a spectrum from abusive to healthy. And one of the most important things we can develop as adults is spectrum thinking. And
yes.
I really appreciated that in regards to all of Taste of Truth Tuesdays. We're all about dissecting dogma. The spectrum-based thinking has been really important for me in any decision-making. And that's, I don't want to fall for the dogmatic. I've been on both sides of far left, far right, and it didn't feel good. Right. And I knew that I wasn't thinking clearly, and I ended up paying the consequences down the road. And so is there anything you want to touch on about spectrum-based thinking before I ask you the final question for today?
Well, if my clients were floating in the air here listening, they'd be like, oh my gosh, this is one of Connie's questions all the time. Hey, I wonder what would it look like to put that into a spectrum. Number, they will roll their eyes at me and we'll laugh. I'm like, and they're like, okay, yeah. Because we have our Western mindset is so all or nothing. It is just our language. I always, even I am this or I am that is just all or nothing. And its language construct. And to start using words like, I'm dealing with a fairly significant amount of depression, rather than I am depressed. There's all kinds of language stuff here. I'm getting out of a church that from all indications was very unhealthy. Okay, that's really fair. Very, less, kind of, could be. There's language, and we don't like that because we're trying to make a point, especially in this polarized political climate we're living in. It's like we dig in our heels. Either side digs in their heels and makes the other side the ultimate enemy, and we are the ultimate good.
Yeah, the us versus them is too much. I was like, why is the entire country now this dynamic that I thought I just tried to deconstruct them? Well, it's not actually. It's being perpetuated that way. But if we get out there and talk to each other, I feel like it's not as polarized as it might.
It's not exactly as it would seem.
There's more spectrum thinking than the media wants you to know.
Yes, exactly. And media and social media.
Yeah.
It's just, so I think that that to me is, well, DBT, and that whole thing is to say, where is my all or nothing thinking getting me into deep problems? And for most of us, it does. And to be able to soften it and say, what is a little bit more realistic?
Right. Is that always true? Yes, I messed up here, but I don't always mess up.
Right.
Or what's the evidence for that? I'm really, really fearful this is going to happen. One of the things that I really play around with, I always play around with this is the best and the worst case. But my therapist many years ago said, well, what's most likely going to happen? I was like, oh, snap. Likely, that's really helpful.
And often it's not the best or the worst.
It's not
It's not, a lot of times, realistically, it's somewhere in the middle. It's like, that is life, first of all.
Yeah.
That is, to me, that is life. You've got, at any given moment, you have a mixture of painful, difficult things and situations and life domains that are causing pain. And at any given moment, you've got situations that are quite beautiful and good, and some that are just neutral and there. And that is just normal life. Do we have a strong tilt, stronger some ways? Yes. But like when I had cancer, our finances, we lost our home because of it. Our finances, my physical health, my mental health.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I was hanging on for dear life.
I bet.
It was one of the richest, most beautiful times with my friendships and my family. I was just like, I cannot believe what's coming back to me here. Like, it was rich. It was beautiful. And I'll always remember that as a time when I'm like, that was just beautiful. So at the same time, that those two things can be happening, and
you were able to hold multiple truths at one time, and that's a sign of healing. That's a sign of emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we were saying really along the whole conversation, is ideally as we heal and progress, we can look back with a different perspective and be able to hold multiple truths.
Exactly. We hold multiple truths about the people we have to, about the people closest to us. They're humans. My husband, I'm literally one of the happiestly married people I know. Can I tell you his faults? Oh, grab a notebook. I can tell you, start writing. And I adore him.
Yeah.
And all of that is true. Do his faults drive me crazy?
Of course.
That is what you hold all the time with life, in my opinion. And when we start minimizing one or the other, or certain ones, to say those don't count, but this counts everything, then we're getting into mental health problems. I think existential problems.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so we're at the hour, and this does lead us to the last question about emotions. Like, culture and society deems some emotions good, some emotions bad. And that's kind of what we were just talking about, is actually we need to make, and then the book, Tao of Feeling, written by Pete Walker, he talks about how we have to embrace all the emotions. And in high control religious environments, certain emotions can be suppressed. We can be taught, especially females, not to be angry. But the aftermath of the spiritual or religious abuse is this erosion of self-trust. And that's what I really want to touch on, is that these abusive messages can lead us potential to further harm. We might be more vulnerable to further harm. In my experience with biblical counseling, I was often told that anxiety, anger, sadness were sinful, and verses like rejoice in the Lord or be anxious for nothing in Philippians were used to suppress my feelings. So the last question is, how do these spiritually abusive environments control members' emotions? And then how can someone like me, as a survivor, begin to reclaim my self-trust and my emotional autonomy after years of being told that these were wrong or sinful, not even just by religion, but by society as well?
Right. And you put a gender issue in there, which I think is worth noting. This is a bell curve. It is not for everybody. But as a general rule, women are allowed to be sad and fearful. We are not allowed to be angry. Men are allowed to be angry. They're not allowed to be sad or fearful. And so, you've got that. It's just a horrible double standard, because women need to be angry and men need to be sad and afraid. That is the human condition. It is the human experience. And when we alienate or exile those parts that are feeling that, it's an interesting thing. You're connecting this lack of self-trust. There's a part of us that knows that. And there's a part of us that knows we're not getting our full wisdom because we're not experiencing some more uncomfortable and difficult emotions. Those are not, as a general rule, anger, sadness, and fear are not a good time. Guilt, shame, those are rough. And if they're there, they're there. And they are giving us important information, significant information about ourselves, about life, about our situation. Right. People now kind of are surprised by this, but I always struggled to get angry. And now I'm kind of like this, old past middle-aged broad that's like, oh, I'm pissed, and they're like, you used to have a hard time being angry. I'm like, oh gosh, yes, I was socialized in this culture and the church, and I was a firstborn, and anger in my home was not okay.
Right.
My mom didn't get angry very often at all. She kind of suppressed a lot of it. And my dad would get really angry and then do shame spirals around getting angry. So anger was just like, so here I was, firstborn girl going, I don't do anger, but anger is such an important, invaluable piece of information for my system. I have way better boundaries now because I get pissed, and anger and boundaries go together. So this whole issue of self-trust, there's a part of you that knows you're not getting the whole information. There's a wisest part of you that says, okay, do I go back into this relationship that's hurting me because it's the nice thing to do? Whereas if you're really accepting all the emotions to be able to say, oh no, actually I'm super pissed about this and I have no desire to have more, more relationship with that person. Okay, you just got a super important information. And that actually builds self-trust to go, I know how to protect myself. I'm using one example here, but I trust myself to protect myself now because I have anger accessible. And that doesn't mean I'm blasting and injuring other people with my anger, but I'm using that anger to say, I don't like that anymore. I'm not doing that.
Right. It's like interesting because if it's suppressed, then it can come out destructive. Yes. And then you mentioned the shame spiral because it probably did come out destructive.
Totally.
But it can be constructive.
Yes, super.
And that's what you were just saying. It's like if I feel this, then, but if it's only if I'm allowed to feel it, process it, and it's how I act on it, because that really is the make or break. I could punch the wall. I could get on social media and vent. And I often do get on social media. I vent on my story and then I delete it. My husband thinks it's hilarious. And I delete it before anybody sees it. Like, why? I was like, I don't know. It's interesting because like if I, as a performer, as a piano player, as a circus performer, if no one's watching, when I'm practicing, it's just like really a different experience. But even if I just put on the camera to record, to think I would share it, not that I would, it changes everything from like how I play, how I perform. I mean, my hands are getting sweaty just thinking about it. And that's really interesting to me. So that aspect of, that's just that accountability, maybe what it is, but that I always want to be constructive with my anger. But if I wasn't able to feel it, or if it was denied, then I'm not getting the privilege to, sharpen it like the tool it can be. And then it ends up coming out being really destructive. And and we mentioned, it's important to recognize and address the bias here for genders in regards to emotions and anxiety. And we mentioned a lot about anger, which is so important. I'm glad you did, because it is really, there's many different levels of anger that will come out when you're coming out of abuse and abusive situations. And that was something I've gotten ridiculed for. It's how dare you, not being very kind. I'm not being forgiving. I'm not being the biblical woman that I should be. Yeah. And, and they're right. I was not being constructive. I was definitely being nasty. And I hear you on that. So I look back and I'm like, that was messy, my bad. But I also am going to extend grace for myself because I was, social, and I try to post as little on my stories as possible now. So, but it's turned out to be like a journal now for a lot of us. Like I used to write a journal and now I document so much more on my Instagram story. I don't know if that's good or bad, but when I was looking at my health journey or anything, I have to go back to how I was writing and sharing there in regards to trying to reflect on the last couple of years. So it's good, it's bad. You can identify that within your own life.
Yes. There's destructive expressions of anger, sadness, and fear.
Yeah,
definitely.
You're right.
That hurt us, that help that hurt us and hurt other people. And there are constructive expressions of all of those too, that are helpful to us and others. So,
and just extend grace to folks, if they're caught up in that amygdala hijack or that fundamentalist narcissistic rage that can come out if, I feel the opposite to you, and you can like have this knee-jerk reaction. I've been there, we've been there, and then just try to extend compassion for folks, or if you can't, just remove yourself from the environment so you don't say something you will regret. I really appreciate this conversation. Is there anything you'd like to add as we are closing it down for the listeners?
No, I just have loved being able to chat
I
with you.
really appreciate it too.
I love what you're doing, and you've got such a fun, and you used the word colorful earlier. I'm like, oh, it's a great word for Megan. Just a sweet, colorful offering, honestly, of all that you've been through and all that you're processing and doing it in real time and letting people bounce off of that is a beautiful thing. So I just love it. I was so happy to be here.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It really touched my heart, and I hope that the listeners got a lot out of it, and I hope that they reach out and contact you if they have any further questions. That's all I have for you today, folks. Thanks again for listening, and if you've yet to leave a 5-star review, I would love it if you could take the time to do so. That helps get this podcast out to more listeners. Please share it with a friend, or I'd love to hear from you. Do you have some feedback? What do you think? And until next time, stay curious, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a great week.